gradients can be successfully used to add color, depth, and visual interest to a design. With them, you can create cool stuff like this, or this, or this, or this, or this. But in the past couple of years, designers kind of steered away from gradients because flat design became so popular. Well, I think now in 2023, gradients are making a comeback, and I'm really happy to see that because they represent a great way of adding dimension to a design, right? So in this course, you'll learn everything you need to know about creating gradients on the web. But hey, if we're just meeting, my name is Adi. I'm a web designer and developer, and we're going to split this course in 3 parts. First, we'll seek to understand gradients, and we're going to take a look at their anatomy. We'll explore some best practices, and we'll also see some real-world examples. Then we'll create some gradients in CSS, and here we'll focus on the most common types, which are linear and radial. And finally, we'll explore some more advanced gradient techniques by looking at gradient overlays, gradient meshes, and gradient text. However, before we get into all that, I want to quickly tell you about Envato Elements. Here you can find tons of useful resources like fonts, icons, UI kits, WordPress themes, music, stock photos, and much more. For creatives like me, this is an awesome resource because all the assets have simple commercial licensing and you're not bound to any contract. Therefore, you can cancel whenever you want. So if you're interested, check out the link in the video description. All right, so let's kick things off by learning about the basics of gradients. Before we get started, you should know that the video description contains links to all the resources that I've used in this course, as well as links to the course files. So if you want to follow along, you can download those from there. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more free content just like this. All right, so let's start with the basics. A color gradient, also known as a color ramp or color transition, is basically a gradual progression of color. We can also think of it as a visual effect that creates a smooth transition between 2 or more colors, blending them together seamlessly. To understand what I'm on about, here's a simple gradient that goes from a very light green to a darker blue. As you can see, the transition between the 2 colors is seamless. Now, when discussing gradients, we need to learn about their anatomy. And here, there are 3 things we need to talk about. That is type, color stops, and direction. First, type. There are several gradient types we can use: linear, radial, conic, or angular, and diamond. The linear gradient creates a transition between 2 or more colors in a straight line. This can be horizontal, vertical, or at any angle in between. The radial gradient creates a transition between 2 or more colors in a circular or elliptical shape. This has a central point from which the gradient spreads outwards. The conic gradient is very similar to the radial because it creates a transition of colors in a circular or elliptical shape. The difference is that while a radial gradient transitions from the center point to the outside, a conic gradient rotates around the center point. Finally, a diamond gradient creates a transition of colors in a diamond shape, with the colors fading out towards the edges of the diamond. Out of the 4 gradient types I just mentioned, the 2 you'll probably be working with the most are linear and radial. Now, let's talk about color stops. Each gradient has at least 2 colors, the start and the end. But we can have any number of colors in between, and those are called color stops. And depending on the number of stops, we can go from gradients that look like this to gradients that look like this. So there really isn't a right or wrong number of color stops. It really depends on the purpose of that gradient. Now, finally, when discussing the anatomy of a gradient, we need to talk about the angle, and this basically refers to the direction of the gradient. For example, this linear gradient can look totally different if I change its direction. We can have a vertical gradient where the colors are aligned at a 90-degree angle from the x-axis, and we can have a horizontal gradient where the colors are aligned with the x-axis. Or we can have an angled gradient where the colors are aligned at a certain angle from the x-axis. In this case, it's 30 degrees. Now, here are a few things you need to keep in mind when working with gradients. And the first one is this. It's really simple to add color stops to a gradient, but that doesn't mean that you have to do it. Usually, you'll stick with 2 colors, but if you want to be brave and experiment with multiple colors, do it in a sensible manner. Otherwise, you'll end up with something like this, which is not exactly visually pleasing. When choosing colors for a gradient, you need to create a smooth transition, and your best bet for achieving that is by going for analogous colors. These sit next to each other on the color wheel, and a great tool for getting them is Adobe Color. By selecting the analogous color harmony, we get 4 great options for a second color. We can also use tints or shades of the main color. These are basically colors created by adding white or black. There are several tools available, and I've linked 2 of them in the video description. Gradients can also contain colors with different levels of opacity, and this will allow that gradient to also blend with the background. This is a technique that works nicely for creating a gradient overlay, for example. As you can see from this demo, the gradient colors blend well with each other, but also with the image background. Finally, always think about accessibility. Just because we're not working with a solid color, but with a gradient instead, it doesn't mean we have to disregard accessibility, right? Color contrast. You need to always think about the color contrast ratio and stick to the WCAG standards. If this is not familiar to you, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they're basically a set of recommendations for making web content more accessible for people with disabilities. Now, there are several ways of checking color contrast, but one of the best tools I've found is the one you see here. It's made by Fabrizio Bianchi, and you can find a link in the video description. All right, so now that we've learned the anatomy of a gradient and also some best practices for using them, let's see how other people have implemented them in real websites. And we start with this, Envato Elements. In the home page, we have these filter cards that have gradients applied to them, but they also have gradients applied to the border, and we can clearly see that when we hover on them. I think this is just a great use of gradients, just to add that little extra dimension to a design. The second example is Stripe. This features some really nice animated, blurred gradients in the background. They are also displayed here in the inner pages, right? We can see those animated gradients yet again. But also something that I really like is they apply those gradients to the icons as well. So if we're gonna increase the zoom level here to an obscene amount, you can see that these icons have a very slight, very subtle gradient applied to them. And it's not just one icon, it's basically all of them, right? You can see the green here, it's kind of a gradient. If I open up my color picker, you can see that we're going from a lighter version of the color to a darker version. And that's like really cool. The purple seems to be solid color overall, but the green and actually some of these other colors, yeah, they're using a very subtle gradient. So yeah, Stripe, if you want to see an example of gradients done right, go to the Stripe website. Really cool. Another example is the Zeus Jones website. Apart from some gradients being used as an animation here in the background, we can also see them being used, let me actually zoom in here, as underline for links. Pretty cool. I really like that approach. And of course, they are using them here in some of these images as well, and in a few other places around the website. But yeah, using them as borders for these links, and they're also animated. That's really cool. Another example is monograph communications. This features a gradient as the background for the entire page. And what's really nice is that when you change the page, you get a different gradient. So this is the one for the About page, Services page gets a different version. And of course, the Contact page gets a different version. Cool. Very simple, but I like it. And the last example that I want to show you is Antara Studio. This also uses gradients, but in a much more subdued way. So we just have some radial gradients going on here in the background, in the first page. And that's about it, really. They didn't go overboard like other places. Instead, they just used them in that place, in the header of the page, basically. Of course, we can see them in other pages, but they're only present here in the header/hero area of the website. Okie dokie. Now let's see some key takeaways. A color gradient, also known as a color ramp or color transition, is a gradual progression of color. We can also think of it as a smooth transition between two or more colors. There are several gradient types we can use: linear, radial, conic, and diamond. The linear gradient creates a transition between two or more colors in a straight line. This can be horizontal, vertical, or at any angle in between. The radial gradient creates a transition between two or more colors in a circular or elliptical shape. This has a central point from which the gradient spreads outwards. The conic gradient is very similar to the radial because it creates a transition of colors in a circular or elliptical shape. The difference is that a conic gradient rotates around the center point. A diamond gradient creates a transition of colors in a diamond shape, with the colors fading out towards the edges of the diamond. Each gradient has at least two colors, the start and the end. It can also have any number of colors in between, and those are called color stops. Gradients can also have a direction, which can be horizontal, vertical, or at an angle. When creating gradients, consider the following best practices. Use the right colors, preferably analogous ones. Use opacity to blend with the background. And don't forget about color contrast. So with this lengthy part out of the way, let's move on and learn how to create gradients with CSS. As I was saying previously, the two most common gradient types you'll be using are linear and radial. So these are the ones we'll be focusing on. Let's start with the linear. I prepared a very simple demo for you. We have this hero area, I guess we can call it, and we have a button. And let's say I want to add a gradient to this button. How do we do that? Well, in our code, we can see the button has a class of width gradient, right? So let's target that class, and we're going to say the following. A gradient, first of all, is like a background image. So we're going to use background image. You can also use the shorthand background property if you want. And I'm going to say linear gradient. And here I can say red, comma, blue. And that's going to create a gradient that by default goes from top to bottom, from red to blue. These are the colors that I just set here. Of course, I can have as many colors as I want. Now, in my case, I'm using some custom properties, and I have the GC gradient colors set up right here. So GC1, GC2, and GC3. So in my case, I'm going to say var GC1 and var GC2. So now my gradient, let's make this a little bit bigger. My gradient goes from this light blue to a slightly darker blue. And by default, we go, as I said, from top to bottom, but I can easily change the direction by adding a parameter here. For example, to left, and then a comma, and then my list of colors. So now the gradient will go from right to left. I go from the light blue on the right to the dark blue on the left. Or I can say I want it to go to the right. Or I can say go to the bottom right. And that's going to create it at an angle. It goes from top left to bottom right. Or I can say go bottom left or top right. So I have a lot of control over the direction of the gradient. Now, if I don't want to use keywords like this, I can specify a fixed angle. For example, I can say go 64 degrees. So now the gradient is going to go 64 degrees from this bottom left corner. I can tell it to go 90 degrees, and that's going to go basically from left to right. I can tell it to go 0 degrees. That's going to go top to bottom. 180 degrees. That goes top to bottom, and so on and so forth. I can do whatever number of degrees I want. Now, as I said, I can have more than two colors. So let's say we're going to set 2 right, and let's add a third color here. I'm going to add my GC3. So now I have a gradient that goes to the right with a start, end, and a color stop in between, right? So I have 3 colors going on. But here's the cool part. I can decide where these colors start, because now they start, or they're positioned automatically, right? So the first color is here, the second is right in the middle, and the third is right at the end. But I can say, for example, that I want the first color to start at 10 pixels. I want the second color to start at 20%. And I want the third color to start at 70%. So now I get a totally different result, right? The first color starts at 10 pixels right here. The second color starts at 20%, and this one starts at 70%. And another cool thing we can do with gradients is we can actually bypass the transition altogether. So if I want like a clear cut between the two colors, here's how I do that. Let's say I am going to send this to the bottom left. And I'm going to work with two colors, GC1 and GC2, and both of these are going to start at 50%. By doing this, we're essentially cutting off the transition. And now the colors don't blend smooth, they just have a very clear line separating them. So that's how you create linear gradients, right? You use the background image property or the background property, that also works, and then you specify linear gradient and you pass in your parameters. The list of colors is separated by a comma. You can also specify a direction either by using keywords or degrees. And of course, you can use more than one color. And you can also decide where the gradient or the color stop starts. And finally, if you want to remove the smooth transition between gradients, you can set each of them at the same starting location. Now, let's move on to radial gradients. For this second demo, let's say we have this page here, and it's a very simple page, maybe something that's under construction, and we have some simple content on a dark background, and it looks pretty good. But we can actually use gradients to add just a little bit more dimension to this, and for that we're going to use radial gradients. So here's how we do it. The body, in my case, has a class of W gradient. So let's go ahead and target that in CSS. And like before, I'm going to use a background image, but this time I'm going to use a radial gradient. And if I do the typical red and blue example here, you'll see that we go from the first color, red, and it radiates outwards towards the blue. And that's how the radial gradients work. Now, just like before, I have some custom properties, GC1 and GC2, and these are basically shades of the primary purple color that I'm using. So instead of using red and blue, of course, we're going to use GC1 and GC2. So save that. And now, just by doing that, this looks a lot better, in my opinion, right? We have this kind of vignette effect going on. And we go from this lighter purple towards the darker purple. And by doing this, we're actually drawing the user's attention towards this area because it's a bit lighter in color. See how much of a difference we can make with just one gradient if we were to remove this, right? So this is what we had before, and this is what we have after. Much, much, much better. Now, just like linear gradients, we can do a lot of things to tweak how a radial gradient looks like. For example, we can set where a specific color starts. I want this to start at 70%. So I want a bit more of the second one than the first, right? And this kind of limits the area of spread for the lighter color. Something else we can do is we can change the location of the center point, right? Or the starter point. By default, it's right in the middle, but we can use at and then specify the location. So I want this to be in the middle, 50% on the x-axis, but on the y-axis, let's say I want it to be around 25%. So it's going to be, the center is going to be around here somewhere instead of here. And also, let's change this to 80%. Now, by default, this gradient kind of takes on the shape of its parent. So if the aspect ratio or let's say the parent is kind of a rectangle, then the gradient is going to be an ellipse. But if I want it to be a circle, then I can specify that. I can say, I want this to be a circle. And I can say exactly how big the circle should be. I can say 150 pixels. All right, so that just creates a circle that's 150 pixels, but at the coordinates that I want. In my case, 50% x, 25% y. Now, obviously, this is a bit too small, and I actually want it to be an ellipse. So let's do that. Ellipse. The coordinates are the same, but this time, instead of setting 150 pixels, I can use keywords to determine its dimension. And I can use something like closest side, and this basically sets the dimension in relation to the distance between the center point and the closest side. In this case, it's the closest side of this is this one. If I set this to farthest, farthest side, we're going to have a different dimension, because now the dimension is determined by the distance between the center point and the farthest side, which in this case is probably this one here or this one here. Or I can do something else entirely. I can say ellipse, and I can specify a percentage for its size. I can say something like 72% in width and 96% in height. And also the starting point should be at 50% and 25%. And that's going to create something like this. And those are a few ways you can customize a radial gradient. So looking at these, yet again, we have the radial gradient is declared just like the linear. Yeah, it's declared as a background. And then I can pass in as many colors as I want. In this example, I'm only using 2 colors. I can determine the amount of color for each of them. I can determine the location of the starting point. I can also specify if I want the gradient to be a circle or an ellipse. And I can change its dimensions, either by using keywords like this or percentages. When it comes to browser support, you'll be happy to hear that gradients are supported in all major browsers nowadays. So there is no reason you should not use them right away. One thing that is not fully supported is animating gradients in all browsers, right? But that's a discussion for another time. The gradients themselves work great. So now let's take a look at a few key takeaways. Linear gradients transition from one color to another in a straight line. They can be applied horizontally, vertically, diagonally, or at any angle using the linear gradient function in CSS. Radial gradients transition from one color to another in a circular or elliptical shape. They can be applied using the radial gradient function in CSS. Gradients can be applied to a variety of elements, usually by using background properties, such as background or background image. Browser support is great, with all modern browsers supporting both linear and radial gradients. And that's how you can create linear and radial gradients in CSS. Now, what I showed you so far is pretty basic, right? They're pretty basic uses for gradients, but we can do so much more with them. So, coming up, I'm going to show you 3 more advanced use cases for gradients in CSS. All right, so we'll keep things nice and simple and work on 3 demos that will hopefully give you some ideas about CSS gradient use cases. Let's start with the first one. So here we are. Let's try and create some gradient overlays like we see in this reference image, right? So we need to create this with CSS. Of course, we have a description and like this gradient that goes from top to bottom or bottom to top vertically, basically. And we go from a very light to no color here on the top to a very deep purple here at the bottom. And we'll do it starting with this image, which, by the way, you can find linked in the video description. So let's start with this. We basically have an image here, but it's not going to be enough. So what we can do instead, we can use a figure, and let's give it a class of overlay, and we'll paste in the image, and we'll also use a fig caption for the text. And the text says Spring Fashion 23. So now, with the overlay class, we'll do the following. We'll set some dimensions, let's say 20 rem width, 30 rem height, and we'll set a position relative because we want to position the fig caption absolutely, right? So let's see what we got so far. We can see that text here. That's good. Let's make the image. So I'm going to say overlay IMG. Let's give it a width of 100% and a height of 100%, so it completely fills up the figure element. And let's make it object fit cover. So whenever we're resizing this element, the image will resize automatically as well. And let's also make it round. So we'll say border radius 8 pixels. That should do the trick. Great. Now let's move this fig caption inside the image, basically. So we'll say overlay fig caption, position absolute. Let's position bottom 2 rem, left 2 rem. Let's increase the font size, 32 pixels. That's good. Let's make the weight like super heavy, like that. Let's make the text uppercase, like that. Let's change its color to white. And let's set a max width, let's say 3/4 of the way, so 75%, like so. And let's also change its line height, 1.2 m, should do the trick. Something like that. Great. Now, let's see about the actual overlay, the color, the gradient. We're going to use a before pseudo element. It's very simple to do. So we're going to say overlay before or after, it doesn't really matter. Content, it's going to be blank. Let's position this absolutely also. And let's make it as wide and as tall as the parent element. For that, we're going to say inset 0. This basically sets top, right, bottom, and left to 0, which makes it the full width, full height of its parent element. Let's also give it a border radius so it matches whatever the parent has. And then background color, or sorry, background image. Let's use a linear gradient, 180 degrees, so top to bottom. And we go from RGBA 87, 32, 114, and 0, right? This starts at 0%, so right at the top. And we go to, again, RGBA, same value, 87, 32, 114, 100%. Right, so we go from this bit with 0% opacity from the top, and we go to this value at the bottom. Of course, we can use simple RGB here since we don't have an alpha channel. But if we want to use an alpha channel, let's say maybe I want to go for, I don't know, 60% opacity. Or, sorry, 0.6. Right? That goes to this color, but with a 60% opacity. In my case, I want, just a full color, so we can just do RGB instead of RGBA. How easy is that, right? And of course, this being a gradient, you can say to right, or you can change its direction in any way that you want. The second example deals with gradient meshes. So we have the same page that we used previously or in a previous demo. So if you remember the radial gradients example that I showed you, where we use the radial gradient to add just a little bit more dimension to this page. Well, now we're going to use gradient meshes to do basically the same thing. And a gradient mesh is made by layering different gradients, in our case, radial gradients. And you can go ahead and do it by hand, but I recommend you use a tool like Mesher, which is created by CSS Hero. So a gradient mesh basically looks like this. And if I hover on it, you can see that we have different points. These represent the starting points for radial gradients. You can clearly see that when I move them around. And these are layered. They're displayed one on top of the other. And if I press the spacebar on this tool, I can actually randomize these gradients. So once I find one that I like in terms of the colors being used and their placement, I'm looking something with maybe something like this with some purple, because my page here also has some purple. So what I can do is I can actually get this this background color, and I can change it right here, right? And I can see a preview of what that looks like. And it's not quite there yet. Let's play around some more. Maybe this one? Not quite. What about this one? So this could work, I guess. You can also, just play around with the location of some of these points. Maybe something like this and something like this. And of course, you can change the individual colors for each of these gradients, right? You can click on one and you can change the value here. But let's say you're happy with this version, right? So what you can do is you can click export, right? That's going to give you a preview and the option to copy the CSS code to the clipboard. So once you do that, you can go back to your code editor. In this case, I'm going to apply the style to the body with the class of wGradient. And I'm just going to paste that in, save. And now, if I go back, we can see that I have that bit applied to my page. And of course, this being made from CSS, I can, decide to change these to my liking. I can, maybe make the colors a bit darker, something like this, right? And that's going to change the way the gradient looks like. And if I don't like this, I can go back to the tool and I can hit spacebar to generate another gradient. In my case, after playing around with this tool a little bit, I ended up with something like this. Right? Just a combination of purple and some blue and a little bit of green in there. And I left some of these sections the darker color, the background color. So I have the logo in here, and maybe I, display something else in here. But I think this creates a nice symmetry. And of course, depending on the background and how everything looks like, you can go ahead and maybe change some of the elements that you have. So for example, this badge, I have this set, the background color to primary tint 60 and the color to primary shade 30, but you might want to swap these around again, depending on how it looks like and how it blends with the rest of your background. But yeah, that's a super easy way of creating these super nice gradient backgrounds. Use a tool instead of coding by hand. There are a few gradient mesh tools out there, but I found this one, Mesher, to be my favorite. You can use whatever you want. And finally, our third demo is about working with gradient text. So for our demo, we have like the top portion of a website, where in the hero area, we have this very large heading or very large piece of text. And I want to highlight this digital word, right? I wanted to make, to add a gradient to it. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to single out this word. We need a way to target it with CSS. So if we look at the HTML code, we just have an H1. So what I can do is I can wrap this in a span element. Right? So I'm going to have H1, create your, and digital is going to be displayed in a span element. Obviously, this has no effect immediately because we didn't apply any kind of styling to that span. So what we can do is we can say H1 span, and let's add a nice background to it. If you are struggling for inspiration, I can recommend UI Gradients. This is a great website for getting a few ideas for gradients. You can cycle through these one by one. They'll each give you a name and the colors used, or you can click this to show all the gradients. You can even sort them or filter them by color. In my case, for this application, I'm looking for something called Cinnamint. It's this one right here. And once you're happy with this, you can actually copy CSS code. So you click this button, you click it, yeah, you go back to your code, you paste that in, right? So now you have a background applied or a gradient applied to your text. But this is not really what we want. Yeah, we singled out the text, but I want the gradient to be applied to the text itself, not the text background. Well, to make that happen, we need to do the following. We need to set the background clip property, which basically determines the background painting area. We need to set that to text. And of course, in WebKit browsers, we need to use a prefix like so. So now the background is not visible. Why is that? Well, it's there, but it's only applied to the shape of the text. But we cannot see it because the text is colored. So if we say color transparent, it's going to render the color of the text transparent, which means we can see behind it, therefore revealing our gradient. Quite simple to do. It works in all the browsers, right? As you can see here, we are using some prefixes. This is not necessary for the gradient, but it is necessary for the background clip, which makes this whole thing possible. So either use an auto prefixer to add these prefixes for you, or do it manually. But setting background clip to text, super important, and then hide the original color of the text by setting it to transparent. And then you can have whatever background gradient you want. You can change the direction, right? You can add multiple colors. You can even do a mesh gradient if that's what you want. But when it comes to text, I like to keep it super simple. So a simple two-color gradient works wonders. Okay then, so a few key takeaways. Gradients can be successfully used as image overlays. Just make sure you add some opacity so you can see what's behind the gradient. You can add as many gradients as you want. You simply list them one by one and separate them with a comma. Gradients can also be applied to text. Just make sure you set the background clip property to text and set the text color to transparent. All right, and that's about it for this course. Let us know if you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. As always, don't forget to check out the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more content like this, and also subscribe and learn about web design, web development, and a lot more. It's all free, so make sure to also hit that like button if you liked this video. I'm Adi, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Take care.